Rabbi Sai, we're on DAF Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, and we were talking about the three mitzvos that are agricultural. Normally, agricultural mitzvos only apply in Eretz Yisrael. However, the Mishnah had said that the mitzvahs of Orla and Kilayim, the produce within the tree's first 3 years of growth, and Kilayim, forbidden mixtures of different species together, apply even outside of Eretz Yisrael. And according to Rabbi Eliezer, also Chadash applies outside of Eretz Yisrael. And Rabbi Eliezer had said that it has to do with his understanding of the word moshvosechem, in all of your dwellings. He learned moshvosechem means everywhere, whereas the other opinion of moshvosechem means once you settle and conquer Eretz Yisrael. This got us onto a conversation yesterday about when the Jewish people were first allowed to eat the harvest of Eretz Yisrael upon their initial entry together with Yehoshua into Israel. And the Torah says that they only began to eat the harvest on the 16th of Nisan, which implies that the laws of Chadash started long before they conquered and settled Eretz Yisrael, which would seem to confirm the opinion that moshvosechem means everywhere, not just in a conquered and settled Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara has said, not necessarily so. It's possible that they could have eaten, the laws of Chadash did not yet apply. The reason why they wait till 16th of Nisan to eat new grain was simply because they didn't need it until then, because they had the mun. Now this leads us to a conversation about the mun, which is something that you can mention at your Seder this year. So, Tanya Idach, it's about 10 lines or 11 lines down from the top. Tanya Idach, we have another brisa which says, Uvnei Yisrael achlu es haman arboim shana, that the Jewish people ate the mun for 40 years. This is what the pasuk says. V'chi arboim shana achlu, v'halo arboim shana chaser shloshim achlu. Well, it's really not accurate. They didn't eat it for a full 40 years. They ate the mun for 40 years minus a month. Because when you look in the Torah in Parshas B'Shalach, the Torah tells us, Vayavo Elima, they came to Elim, and then later on it says that on the 16th day of the second month is when the whole mun episode occurred. So it was actually 30 days after leaving Mitzrayim that the mun began to fall. So they didn't eat mun for 40 years, they ate mun for 40 years minus a month. So the Gemara answers, Elalomar lecha ugos shehotziu mimitzrayim ta'amu bahem ta'aman. But this is to teach us that the cakes, the unleavened cakes that the Jews took out with them out of Egypt, tasted like mun. So when you're munching on your shmura matzah, you're munching. Yeah, you'll be saying, it's mamish like the mun. Okay, Tanya Idach. Another brisa says, B'shiva ba'adar meis Moshe, u'b'shiva ba'adar nolad. Moshe Rabbeinu died on the 7th of Adar, and he was also born on the 7th of Adar. Now, minayin sheb'shiva ba'adar meis. Let's look at the date of his death first. How do we know that he died on Zayin Adar? Shenemar vayomas sham Moshe eved Hashem, u'chesiv vayivku b'nei Yisrael es Moshe b'arvos Moav shloshim yom. We know that Moshe dies in Arvos Moab, in the plains of Moab. The Jews cry for him for 30 days. This is what the Torah says. Uchasiv vayihi acharei mos Moshe eved Hashem, uchasiv Moshe avdi meis v'ata kum avor. Now, if we look and say for Yehoshua, the Psukim say that Moshe had died, and God tells Yehoshua, it's now time for you to pass over the Jordan River. Uchasiv ivru b'kerev hamachaneh. And God tells Yehoshua that in 3 days you're going to pass over the Jordan. So Hashem speaks to Yehoshua after 30 days of crying or mourning for Moshe. He says, after those 30 days are over, in another 3 days, in other words, 33 days after Moshe's death, you're going to pass over the Jordan River. And we know that the pasuk in Yehoshua says that they crossed over the Jordan on what day? On the 10th of Nisan. So if they passed over on the 10th of Nisan, and that was 33 days after Moshe died, so that, of course, is very simple math. It tells us that Moshe died on the 7th of Adar. That's how we know. So now, the Gemara then asks the question, Moshe. How do you know that Moshe was born on the 7th of Adar? We know that he died on the 7th. How do you know that he was born on the same day? Because Moshe said to the people in Parshas Vayelech, I am 120 years old today. I can no longer go out and come in. So she'ein tamul omer hayom, ma tamul omer hayom. Melami she'HaKadosh Baruch Hu yoshev v'mumale shenosim shel tzadikim miyom liyom u'mechodesh lechodesh. There was no reason for Moshe to say, I'm 120 today. He was 120 the day before, and he'll be 120 the day after. Like, what's the point? The point is that that was his birthday. He dafka turned 120 that day, and it's to teach you. And it was on that day that he was passing away, and it's to teach you that Hashem completes the years and the months of a tzaddik, to arrange that a person will, as Shenamar, as Mispar Yamecha Amalei, as the pasuk says, that one of the blessings to a tzaddik is, I will complete the days of your lives, right? So to live a full year, to live a full 120 years, that's a siman of that a person is a righteous person. I always use this mathematical equation. If we know that Moshe was born on the 7th of Adar, then that also explains why we decorate the shul with greenery on Shavuos. Because he was born on 7th Adar, and 3 months after 7th Adar, when he was a baby, he was put in the ark, in the little basket, in the Nile with the bulrushes, right? So that also explains why, that's one of the reasons brought down as to why we decorate with greenery to represent the bulrushes that Moshe was amongst in the Nile. So Tanya, Reb Shimon ben Yochai Omer, Shalosh mitzvos nitztavu Yisrael b'chinisasin la'aretz, v'noagos bein baretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So the Brisa just now goes back to our discussion of these 3 agricultural laws that apply both in and out of Eretz Yisrael. And they were given these mitzvahs immediately upon entry into Eretz Yisrael. What the Brisa really means is that those mitzvahs were extant as soon as they were given in the desert. But since the Jews didn't plant in the desert, they didn't have an agricultural society in the desert. So these mitzvahs could only be practiced on a practical basis once they came into Eretz Yisrael, but they were extant everywhere. And v'hu adin sheyinhagu, and it's only logical that from one we can expand out the other 2. Meaning, Uma Chadash in the Kal V'chomer is like this. We know that Chadash, because it says Moshe Vosechem, and this Bryce is learning that Moshe Vosechem means everywhere. Uma Chadash ein Yisuru Isser Olam vein Yisuru Isser Hanavi Yisheter li Yisuru Noheg bein Baretz bein Bechutz la'aretz Kilayim she Yisuru Isser Olam v'Yisuru Isser Hanav vein Heter li Yisuru Enodin sheinagu bein Baretz bein Bechutz la'aretz. That the Kal V'chomer works like this. If Chadash has 3 leniencies, first of all, it's not usher forever, Chadash. The grain eventually becomes permissible once the 16th of Nisan arrives. Number 2, there's no Isser Hana. You're allowed to derive benefit, you're just not allowed to eat it. So, for example, you could feed it to your animals. And third, V'yesh Heter li Yisuru, which means that on the 16th of Nisan itself, if you bring the Korban HaOmer, that acts as the trigger to permit the edibility of Chadash. If you don't bring the carbon, then it naturally expires. So it has 2 features of temporariness to it. So, and yet, it still is a mitzvah that applies everywhere in the world. So then surely kilayim, which is a forbidden mixture of different species, specifically when we talk about the prohibition, we talk about grapes and wheat. So then that prohibition is everlasting. Anything that you grow as a mixture, there's no expiration date. And v'isur and isur hana, and it's asur bahana, you can't even derive any benefit from it. The ein heter lisron, there's no mechanism, there's no action that you can do to alleviate the isur. So certainly that should apply both in and outside of Eretz Yisrael. V'hu adin la'orla b'shtayim. And using that argument, you can apply the Kal V'chomer to Orla based on 2 out of those 3 arguments. In that, whereas Orla does have an expiration date, which means that even though the fruit itself of Orla will always be prohibited, but eventually that tree will mature, and the fruit that grows on the tree after 3 years will be permitted. But nonetheless, Orla is Asr B'Hana'ah, and secondly, there's no mechanism, there's no action that you can do to permit Orla. You just have to wait naturally for it to grow. So then, therefore, you see that if it's true that Chadash applies in both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz, then surely Orla should also apply in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. Rabbi Elazar v'Rabbi Shimon Omer, he says, Kol mitzvah shenitztavu Yisrael kodem kinisasin la'aretz noheges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. La'achar kinisasin la'aretz eino noheges ela ba'aretz. That any mitzvah, he gives us a general rule. He says any mitzvah that the Jews were commanded to perform even before entry into Eretz Yisrael, then those mitzvahs apply both outside and inside Eretz Yisrael. But if a mitzvah was given to the Jewish people to perform only upon entry into Eretz Yisrael, then that clearly is dependent upon the land. But there are exceptions, and the exceptions are, he says, Chutz min hashmotas kesafim v'shiluach avodim she'af al pi shenitztavu aleihem la'achar kenisasan la'aretz noheges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. The exceptions are the expiration of debt. We know that with the arrival of Shemitah also comes the cancellation of debts. That's why we did a prusbul, right? Not too long ago, right? So the same thing, and also sending away your Hebrew slave on the Yovel year, even though the Jews were told that they should only practice this mitzvah upon entry into Eretz Yisrael with the practice of Shemitah and Yovel. Nevertheless, this mitzvah applies even if you live outside of Eretz Yisrael. If you live outside of Eretz Yisrael, you live in Bavel, and you have a Hebrew slave, you still have to send out your Hebrew slave. And if you are a creditor, you have to cancel that debt upon the arrival of Shemitah. Now, Hashmatas Kesafim Chovas Agufi. So the Gemara's question on this whole brisa is, isn't the brisa stating the obvious? Cancellation of debts is not based in agriculture, so obviously it applies everywhere, because we had another general rule that any mitzvah that is not agriculturally based applies everywhere. So why then does the brisa have to make a point of saying that the cancellation of debts applies even outside of Eretz Yisrael? I already know that. The Gemara says, Lo nitzracha ela l'chidetanya. I'll tell you why, because I might have thought based on the following brisa. The Tanya Rebbe Omer v'zed devar hashemita shamot b'shtei shmitos hakasuv medaber echa shmitas karka ve'echa shmitas kesafim. The Brisa makes note of the fact that when the Torah talks about the cancellation of debts, it uses the word shmita in some form twice in the pasuk, and it's there to link the agricultural law of shmita to the financial law of shmita of the cancellation of debts. Bizman she'ata meshamet karka, ata meshamet ksafim. Bizman she'ata meshamet karka, i'ata meshamet ksafim. And therefore, the pasuk is teaching me that the law of cancellation of debts historically only applies when Shemitah is practiced in Eretz Yisrael. When Shemitah is no longer practiced in Eretz Yisrael, then the laws of cancellations of debts do not apply. Now, does Shemitah apply today in Eretz Yisrael?
Yes.
It does, but there are poskim who say that it's only there midrabanan.
It's not wrong.
Because you don't have the majority of Klal Yisrael, or you don't have all Yud Beis Shvatim settled in Eretz Yisrael, depending upon how you learn. And if that's the case, then the law of cancellation of debts really does not apply midioraisa. That Shemitah, and that was, by the way, the whole reason why Hillel was at liberty to compose the prusbul. And as we've discussed this before, the only reason why the prusbul works is because Shmitas Ksafim is a rabbinic law, it's not a biblical law. And we learn that from this pasuk, that the only time that the law of cancellation of debts applies is when Shemitah is extant in Eretz Yisrael, midioraisa. So let's point out that what the Gemara is teaching us is as follows. While it's true that when Shemitah is extant in Eretz Yisrael, the laws of cancellation of debts are extant throughout the world, I might have thought that because the Torah links the two together, that you should only practice cancellation of debts inside Eretz Yisrael proper. But that's not the way we're learning. We're learning that it applies everywhere, but only at the time when Shemitah is being practiced in Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara says, well, if the Torah is linking the two, ve'ema b'makom she'ata mishami karka ta mishabe ksafim, u'v'makom she'nata mishami karka inata mishabe ksafim. So the Gemara says, how do you know? If the Torah is linking the two together, maybe then the law of cancellation of debts only applies in the very place where Shemitah applies in Eretz Yisrael. Link them together completely. The Gemara answers, Talmud Lomar ki karashim Ital Hashem mikol makom, because there's an extra phrase in the pasuk that indicates that anytime a Jew cries out Shemitah, it means he gets to cancel a debt. So therefore, it's not dependent upon a Jew living in Eretz Yisrael, it's dependent upon a Jew living anywhere in the world. And therefore you see that although it is linked to Shemitah in one respect as far as time, it's not linked to Shemitah as far as place. So that's why the Brisa had to make a point of saying is that even though Shemitah's Ksafim, cancellation of debts, is linked to agricultural Shemitah, it's only linked to agricultural Shemitah insofar as time. But as far as place, it's not linked to agricultural Shemitah. The same conversation will take place when it comes to sending free, liberating your Hebrew slaves. Shiluach havadim chovas hagufi. Why did the Brisa have to make a point of saying that liberation of slaves applies everywhere in the world? Obviously it does, because it's a chovas haguf, it's a bodily commandment. The Gemara says, Salka daita chamina holu chasuvu krasem doror ba'aretz, because I might have thought that in the context of freeing slaves, the Torah says, proclaim liberty throughout the Aretz, throughout the land. The word Aretz means Eretz Yisrael. Of course, you know the famous quote on the Liberty Bell, right? Krasem deror, right? It's this pasuk, proclaim liberty throughout the land, but the land really refers to Eretz Yisrael. So you might have thought, ba'aretz in b'chutz la'aretz lo. You might have thought that therefore the obligation to free slaves only applies in Eretz Yisrael, not in chutz la'aretz. Talmud Lomar yovel hi mikol makom, and therefore the Torah says it shall be jubilee, which tells you that it's unconditionally yovel no matter where you live. So in kain ma Talmud Lomar ba'aretz. Why then does the Torah point out Eretz Yisrael in that pasuk? So the Gemara answer is Bisman shahadror noheg ba'aretz, noheg b'chutz la'aretz, but ein dror noheg ba'aretz, ein noheg b'chutz la'aretz, because it's telling you that when the laws of Yovel apply in Eretz Yisrael, again, it's the time. When the time of Yovel applies in Eretz Yisrael, it applies in Chutz La'aretz as well. But when there's no Yovel in Eretz Yisrael, there's no Yovel in Chutz La'aretz, there's no law of freeing slaves. And by the way, the Rambam, if I'm not mistaken, writes, I haven't seen it in a while, but the Rambam writes that Yovel stopped being practiced already after the Churban Bayis Rishon. There were no more Yovels until Mashiach comes. So it's even more limited than the practice of Shemitah. Now, Tanan Hasam, we have a Mishnah that says, HaChadash Asr min HaTorah b'chol makom. The Mishnah says that Chadash is prohibited in Chutz La'aretz even midioraisa. Now this is a very, very important statement, because there are many poskim who say that based on this Mishnah, really a person is supposed to be practicing Chadash in Chutz La'aretz. Now, it's been the practice already for centuries, starting in Europe, that people were not careful with Chadash. But more recently, poskim have said that now that we have a more luxurious society and a standard of living, and we have the ability to practice Chadash, it is worthwhile to readopt the Chumrah of Chadash, because there are some poskim who say that it may even be a deoraisa potentially. Orla halacha, the law of Orla in Chutz La'aretz is a halacha, and it's not clear what that word halacha means, it's a law. And v'hakilayim divrei sofrim, and the forbidden mixtures in Chutz La'aretz is rabbinic. My halacha. So what does the word halacha mean in the discussion of Orlas? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Hilchasa Medina. What it means is that it is a halacha that the rabbis instituted and put into practice, which essentially is saying that there's really no difference between Orla and Kilayim. They're both rabbinic laws in Chutz La'aretz. But Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha Moshe miSinai. But Ula says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, no, it's not a rabbinic law. It's a Mosaic tradition, which means that it's elevated to the status of a deoraisa. the laws of Orla and Chutz La'aretz. So Amar Le'ula L'Rav Yehuda Bishlam L'Didi De'amina Halacha L'Moshe Misinai Hainu Deshani Lan Bein Safek Orla L'Safek Kilayim. So Ula argues to Rav Yehuda. He says it makes more sense to say like I'm saying, because according to you, there's no difference between the level of stringency between Orla and Kilayim. But according to me, Orla is elevated above just the rabbinic law. It's halacha l'Moshe misin. It's a Mosaic tradition that's passed down from Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore, it would make sense now that what we're about to see that we're more stringent with the laws of Orla than we are with the laws of Kilayim in cases where there's a suffix, where you're not sure whether what the produce that's being placed before you is prohibited or not. Where is this? None. The Mishnah says, Safek orla ba'aretz aser b'surya muter b'chutz la'aretz yard v'lokeach u'v'vad shelo yir'ena locate. The Mishnah talks about Safek orla, which means you're not sure whether the produce that is in front of you is orla or not. So in Eretz Yisrael it's aser, because there everyone agrees that the law is min Torah. And in Surya, it's permitted. Surya is annexed Eretz Yisrael, meaning that David HaMelech went on a campaign to expand the borders of Eretz Yisrael, and he conquered portions of Syria. There, we learned that in some respects it's like Eretz Yisrael, in some respects it's not like Eretz Yisrael. And in this respect, as far as specifically the law of Safek Orla, you can be lenient. And in the third law, if you're completely, for sure, outside of Eretz Yisrael, if you're in Bavel, Yored v'lokeach u'v'vad shelo yir'ena locate. You can instruct a Gentile to go ahead and harvest from an orchard where you know that there's potentially Orla there, as long as you're not supervising him to see him go dafka to young trees and harvest Orla produce. So it seems like we're very liberal when it's in Chutz La'aretz. However, v'ilu gabe, as long as you're not sure that he's going to get the Orla. V'ilu gabe kilayim, but you'll see with kilayim we're even more liberal. Tanan kerem hanatua yerek v'yerek nimkar chutzalo, ba'aretz asur b'surya muter b'chutz la'aretz yerd v'lokid v'vat shelo yilkot biyad. So the Mishnah says by a vineyard that has vegetation growing around it, so if there's both vegetation that's mixed in with the vines, and there's vegetation on the outskirts of the vines, and so there's like continuing vegetation, some of it is mixed as kilayim with the vines, and some of it grows beyond the vines, so then it depends like this. Ba'aretz aser, in Eretz Yisrael, all of that vegetation, like that vegetable growth, is aser. In Syria, it's mutter because it's annexed Eretz Yisrael. It's not Eretz Yisrael proper, and you're only dealing with a suffix. And in L'chutz La'aretz, you can be so liberal that you can instruct the Gentile to go and harvest it for you, and even instruct him to harvest from the portion that you know for sure is mixed in as kilayim. So you see that we're even more liberal for kilayim than we are for Orla. For Orla, I cannot instruct him explicitly to take from the young trees. I can tell him harvest from that orchard as long as I'm not supervising him taking from the young trees. But with Kilayim, I can even instruct the Gentile to take from the forbidden portions, the mixture itself, and that's perfectly okay, as long as I don't do it myself. So that makes sense, says Ula, because I hold that there's a differentiation between a halacha l'Moshe Misinai and a purely rabbinic law. Ela l'didach, nisni ozev v'zeh yored v'lokeach, ozev v'zeh yored v'lokate. But according to you, they should both be on the same rabbinic standard. According to you, either both Orla and Kilayim should be that you can instruct the Gentile to take, as long as you don't know that he's for sure taking from the forbidden section, or the law for both of them should be that you can instruct him to take even from the forbidden section. Because, so that's the question that he's asking on Rav Yehuda. So the Gemara answers, Ha'amar lei Shmuel Rav Anan, Tani ozev v'zeh yored v'lokeach, ozev v'zeh yored v'lokate. So Taka Shmuel was bothered by this question as well, and he actually told the person who was reciting the Mishnah in his presence, he said, there's got to be something wrong. One says lokeach and one says locate. The difference between the two words, lokeach and locate, is one letter. It's a ches or a tes. He says there's something wrong here. Either both of them have to be written as lokeach or both of them have to be written as locate, because Shmuel agrees with Rav Yehuda that the law is exactly the same in Chutz La'aretz for Safek Orla and Safek Kilayim, and therefore there should not be two different standards. The Gemara now tells us a brief story. Mar berei deravna masni le lekula zevese yarid veloked v'vad shal yilka biat. So before we get to that, Mar berei deravna says that both Mishnahs, both dealing with Safek Orla and Safek Kilayim, both are lenient and both have the word locate, which means that you can instruct the Gentile explicitly to take even from the forbidden section, even when you know he's going to be taking from Orla or from the Kilayim mixture. Amarle Levi lishmuel Aryach Safek li va'ana echol question mark. So Levi was very bothered by this, and he told Shmuel. He says, "How can it be?" He called Shmuel Aryoch. Aryoch is the name of an ancient Canaanite king that's mentioned in the Torah. And the reason why he called him by that name, he says, "You are the ancient ruler of our people," meaning that your word is the final authority. And he said to him like this. He says, "Safek li va'ana echol. How can it be that I don't know whether there's Orla and Kilayim in here, and I'm permitted to eat it, and therefore I prefer not to eat it, and I prefer not to be lenient, even though it's in Chutz La'aretz." Rav Ivya v'Rabba bar Rav Chanan misafku sfuke lahadadi amri charife de pumpadisa ein Orla b'Chutz La'aretz. And Rav Ivya and Rabba bar Rav Chanan were very liberal when it came to the laws of Orla, because they lived in Bavel, and they said to each other, "Listen, I'm not going to eat Orla myself, but what I will do is I will harvest Orla and give it to my friend and not tell him explicitly that it's Orla." And the other friend did the same to his friend. So they switched, they swapped from their orchards Orla produce, not telling the other one that it was Orla. And the reason why they were able to be that liberal is because they quoted the earlier rabbis of Pumpadisa, which Rashi says are Ifa and Avimi b'nei Rachba, and because they said that there's no bichlal, no law of Orla in Chutz La'aretz, and it's on that basis that as long as we're not taking it explicitly ourselves and eating it ourselves from the tree, as long as we give it to somebody else and don't tell them that it's Orla, it's perfectly okay. Have a wonderful day.